In this episode, I show you how I prep my Star Wars figures. So before doing anything like painting the miniatures, I tend to make sure there's no mold lines. And I'll use an X-Acto and just scrape the line. I know Games Workshop makes a little scraper especially for this, but I find X-Acto blades work a little bit better and they're cheaper, and I can replace them when they get dull. So then I go back and work on the arms. There's a little bit in the back here. Just going to scrape it off. Make sure there's no other mold lines that you can see, because there's nothing worse, especially if you dry brush a miniature, to get your brush hitting any of these mold lines, because you'll just get a really bright color right where the line is and a lighter color everywhere else, and it just doesn't look good. So just continue scraping. Sometimes scraping isn't enough. There's irregularities or something in the miniature, so I'll use these microfiles just to make sure everything's nice and smooth. Once they're done, I dry fit. You don't want to glue at this point, because when you're going to be painting the details, the arms are going to get in the way. But you want to make sure that everything fits in perfectly at this point, or else when the miniature's painted, if you need to start trimming, you might lose some paint and have to do some touch-ups that aren't fun to do. So there's the first two guys trimmed, and it's the same for all of them. We just go through and scrape the mold lines, make sure everything looks nice and pretty. For some of the miniatures, like the lightsabers, they'll occasionally come in bent, and just trying to bend it back into place, it'll always return back to this position. So what I do is I take the really hot water from the sink, place it under it so it softens the plastic, and then put it back where I want it and put cold water. Next thing I do after having prepped everything is I wash the miniatures. Just take a bit of warm tap water, some liquid detergent, and just let them soak for a bit. When the models come back from the factory, they're usually covered in a bit of mold release, which is a grease to let them come free from the molds. That usually prevents the primer from really sticking to the miniature. So you want to make sure that you get all of that out and rinse the miniatures really well after the soap, because soap will do the same thing. You just don't want any slick surface on the miniature. Now that the miniatures are nice and clean, it's time to dry them. So I just put them on a dishcloth, pat them dry for a bit, and then just let them sit there till everything evaporates. You don't want a wet miniature when you're priming it or painting it. So, all right, now it's time to paint them. I tend to use an airbrush. I find it's a lot quicker and easier and makes a better coating. What I'll do is I'll affix them with some super glue to a popsicle stick, and then use some poster tack to put it on a bottle to hold it, to make it easier to paint them. And first I'll put a coat of black primer all over the miniatures. You might be wondering why black on a stormtrooper who's typically white. This gives it a bit more depth. It also helps with the shading. As you'll see later on, I use a technique called zenithal painting, which you start dusting from the top where the zenith of the sun would be, to give it a highlight. And the lower parts and parts that are hidden under the arms, whatnot, cause their own natural shadow with the darkness. So we just keep on airbrushing. I tend to thin my airbrush paint a bit. This is a Vallejo paint. They tend to airbrush pretty well, but I still find that they might clog after a while. Not as much with the blacks, but with lighter colors, they tend to have thicker particles, so they'll just stick in the airbrush. So here we are at this point, we're doing the zenithal highlight. So I've got a lighter paint in my airbrush, and I'm just spraying from the top. This emulates the sun. We want to get all of those high points, like the helmets, the top of the shoulder bells, the back of those calves that are exposed. This creates a natural shadow underneath the arms, anywhere where the sun won't hit. But just remember, as you can see here, paler paints tend to have a thicker particle in order to give better coverage. So make sure that you put enough flow improver or paint thinner and water in your airbrush, or else it'll start getting clogged. That's when you start getting a little specular or no paint coming out of the airbrush.